So that gospel reading, the one we just heard, was the last time that Jesus and his disciples are together in the Gospel of Luke before he ascends into heaven and goes to the Father. And I wonder if that's not the reason that all of these readings today seem to be a little intenser, more intense than usual, maybe a little more somber, because they're I don't think I've ever noticed just how heavy they are. Or maybe, as the shock and joy of the resurrection has started to subside a bit, questions and concerns are starting to emerge. And one of these is, what was the risen Jesus like? Especially since the gospel writer was recording this as the original disciples were starting to die and leaving this for those of us to follow, to ponder. What was the risen Jesus really like? The Bible offers us a few clues. The disciples knew him on sight, so he was still recognizably himself. His body bears the marks of the crucifixion that killed him. So even risen, he still carried those scars. He can touch and be touched. As we learned last week, he can breathe. And as we learned today, he can eat. Although he has a few new abilities, including appearing or vanishing unexpectedly and opening his followers' minds to the scriptures, according to the beliefs at this time of his time, he was definitely alive and not a ghost. But it's not all that surprising that his followers thought he was, especially at first. I have to admit, though, I find Jesus' response to be a little bit baffling when he says, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts?" I mean, this is not exactly something that happens every day. And I can imagine the disciples thinking something like, well, maybe because you were dead and we saw your body? And now here you are? How is this even possible? But then as I sat with this, something else also occurred to me. Yes, the gospel makes it clear they were afraid because they thought Jesus was a ghost, but maybe there was another reason too. Scripture tells us that when Jesus was arrested, all of the disciples deserted him and fled. Peter denied him. Judas betrayed him. And none of them went with him, none of them died with him, even though they swore that they would. All of them, in fact, broke their promises to him. All of them fell short, and they knew it. And maybe that was one of the reasons why they were so afraid. Interestingly, the term "fell short" is in biblical talk is a paraphrase of another important term, and you're mostly, I'm sure, all familiar with it. That word is sin, which, as you may have noticed, is threaded through all of our readings for today. In our tradition, the very mention of the word sin can cause people to quietly start looking around for the nearest exit. It's just not a concept we talk about very much, and we're just not very comfortable with it. And one reason for this may be that many of us grew up in other traditions, which had very different and sometimes damaging outlooks on the nature of humanity and on what constituted a sin. So some of us may have constantly been made aware of our own sinfulness, the many ways in which we fell short of what was expected of us, who we loved, how we prayed, our very identity. And no matter how hard we tried, the gap between who others thought we should be and who we actually were was impossible for us to bridge, and we were flooded with shame. Others of us may have believed that we were called to live a godly life, but doing so, tracking our behavior, monitoring our words, constantly adhering to this round of things to do, was exhausting and left us feeling separated from God and one another. Still others may have just decided to opt out of this entire concept of sin, given its destructive framing. But that left us bereft in a different way. if sin doesn't exist, how do we name and discuss such things as war, genocide, indifference to the fate of our planet, and unmitigated greed? How do we describe school shootings and our indifference to this without the word sin? Which brings me to another question that we have now. How do we talk about sin and sinfulness in a post-resurrection world in a way that neither minimizes its damage or re-traumatizes us? One of the things that may be helpful is to remember that in our readings today, and indeed in much of the Bible, conversations and exhortations about sin are almost always directed at groups, not individuals. Yes, there are exceptions, like King David and Uriah the Hittite and Bathsheba, ugly little story. But most often, sin is explored as a collective social issue, one that the whole group needs to address, rather than individual failings of which we should be ashamed. And you may have noticed in our church, we have a similar focus. Pastoral rites like the rite of reconciliation are definitely available for any individuals who feel an overwhelming sense of shame. But within our faith community, our shared regular practice is to reflect upon our collective sins, to confess them, and then be absolved as a congregation, whether in the general confession that we say on Sundays or in the great litany once a year. As with so many other things in our tradition, we try to strike a balance between individual guilt and shared responsibility. Another thing that we may find helpful as we do this work is to think about and reconsider our images of God. Do we see God as a stern, judgmental figure, keeping an extra large heavenly spreadsheet of our failings and faults, ready to bring down a celestial hammer if we so much as put a toe out of line? Or are we able to see God as a loving parent who yearns to be closer to us, as today's epistle reading suggests? Or do we have some other image? Many years ago, I went through this struggle, and I came across the writings of a 13th, 14th century English mystic named Dame Julian of Norwich. She had a series of visions which she recorded in a book called Revelations of Divine Love. Not surprisingly, she experienced God as love, and believed that the only true reality, the only reality that really mattered, is love. To Julian, sin is harmful, yes, mainly because it damages one another, but also because it causes us pain and shame. And that separates us from the love of God and from one another, and also from ourselves. In today's reading, we see Jesus providing the disciples and us with a powerful example of this divine love. Let's go back and take another look. As we heard, he returned to the disciples and they were terrified. Maybe they thought he was a ghost, or maybe they were afraid he'd be angry at them and cast them into outer darkness, or even call fire down from heaven to consume them like Elijah did. But what did he actually do instead? He greets them with the phrase, "Peace be with you." What that must have been like to hear. He spends a great deal of time assuring them that he is really there, he's really real, he's not a ghost. And if he was upset with them for his desertion, he doesn't show it. He doesn't so much as utter a single word of reproach, anger, or even hurt. Instead, he asks them to feed him, indicating by doing this that they are now empowered to go feed others. He unpacks the meanings of scriptures for them, explaining them so now they understand what happened. And then he pays them the ultimate compliment. He invites them to share in his ministry. They are now invited to tell the world about the love of God, that repentance and forgiveness are available to everyone, regardless of nationality, rank, tribe, station, gender, anything you can think of. Everyone. And, by extension, as those who strive to follow the way of Jesus in our own age, we are invited to do those things too. Now, if you find the notion of doing this just a little bit intimidating, as it certainly was to me, please remember we are invited to share God's love and grace and God's forgiveness. We are not dependent on our own goodness or any grace or anything like that, thank heaven. And we're also invited to do this together. We have one another. This is our shared journey where we work together, sing together, play together, and pray together. The thing I keep going back to, the amazing part of all of this, is that no matter who we are, or where we live, or what we have to give, whether it is a lot or a little, whether we're educated or not, whatever we do in life, all of us, we are all invited to partner with God, to be, as St. Teresa of Avila says, Christ's hand and heart and mind and body in this broken, hurting world. What an amazing Easter gift.